Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Humans Open House PCI DSS 4 Ask the Experts. We're thrilled to have you with us today as we dive into this session packed with valuable insights. Today, you'll hear from our esteemed speaker, Jeff Mann from Online Business Systems, who will answer questions around PCI DSS 4.0, 4.01, whatever we're going to call it today. Before we get started, a quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll share the recording with you afterwards. Feel free to type your questions anytime using the Q&A panel. We'll address them during the session. Now let's jump right in and set the stage with our host from Human, Jamie Ward.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope all is well. We're here today with Jeff Mann, and we're going to dive into the PCI DSS 4.0.1 changes that are coming up on March 29th. I'm sorry, April 1st, correction. They will be in effect for the new compliance changes that you've all been hearing about from the internet to all of your own experts internally. Now, with that, I want to just kind of give Jeff an opportunity to introduce himself and let you all know kind of where his background comes from to be the expert here in PCI DSS.
Thanks, Jamie. Appreciate the opportunity to introduce myself to our listeners and viewers. It's funny, we're coming up to what a lot of people call the deadline and what I consider to be the effective date. And they say in the standard it's after March 31st, 2025. And I really think that's because the council doesn't have a sense of humor and they didn't want to say April 1st, which is, of course, April Fool's Day. But my background, I've been in the information security business over 40 years. I started with the DoD and sort of grew up in cybersecurity as it was becoming a thing. Left the public sector almost 30 years ago and bopped around for a little while and found my way into doing PCI way back in 2004. And I've been doing it ever since. So the payment card industry data security standard has been around for 20 years, and I've been doing it for half my career. Some people call that expertise. I call it experience, but I think the root word's the same, so I'll go with it.
Absolutely. Well, we're excited to have you here today, Jeff. Speaking of timelines of the PCI, council and the regulations they've put forth, you want to walk us through some of the history of how we got to today? I mean, you've seen, since 2022 on this chart, some significant changes. I'm told the newest changes that'll be in effect on April 1 or by end of day on March 31st, 2025 are some of the most significant changes that folks have seen in quite a long time. So let us know kind of how this all became to where we are today, Jeff.
Yeah, a real fast fly through the 20-year history of PCI. Back in the early days of what we now call cybersecurity, very common thing to be stolen once there was bad guys who figured out, hey, we can make money doing this stuff, was stealing credit card information. Information that was being captured during transactions. So obviously there's a lot of focus on merchants and retailers and anybody that was engaging in commerce. And of course, e-commerce was kind of a new thing 20-ish years ago. So when the PCI data security standard was first published, it was technically published by Visa first. All the major card brands had their own set of security standards that they wanted all their cardholders, all their merchants, and all their acquiring banks to agree to and participate in. But they finally came together and agreed, that's kind of silly. Let's agree on one standard, and Visa being kind of the big player, at least number one ranking player at the time. Everything folded into the PCI data security standard. So it was first published October 2004. A couple of years later, the card brands decided to spin up what's called the Security Standards Council, PCI SSC. There's the independent body, governing body that's responsible for putting out the standard. They were formed in 2006, and version 1.1 of the standard was published in October-ish of 2006. And that's what the council will acknowledge is the beginning of the PCI data security standard. The first major revision 2.0 came about in 2010. The shift there was um, identifying or giving you the opportunity to isolate or segment what came to be called as the cardholder data environment. The PCI data security standard has always been 6 overarching goals, divided into 12 major requirements. They were based upon what was called at the time the e-commerce dirty dozen. I've met probably 20 people over the years that claim to have had their hands in writing the thing. I take everybody's word for it. Um, I did not write it. I'll take that credit away from me at least. But when it first came out, it was assumed that everybody had what was called a flat network. Everything was connected, and what was new was plugging into the internet as a backbone. In the version 2, when it came out, it really forced merchants and anybody dealing with card data to start finding the data in their network, because while segmentation has never been a requirement, it was highly recommended, but you don't get to segment and isolate and claim PCI only applies to this small segment of our overall enterprise over here without coming up with some sort of proof that the credit card data isn't in all the other places. So there's a lot of years spent trying to get organizations to do the data trails, follow the data flows, figure out who was consuming all this transaction data, who needed to see the account data, what we now call account data, what we called credit card data back then, or cardholder data. So that was version 2. Version 3 came along 2013, and the emphasis of version 3 was really trying to emphasize and hammer home to people that have to follow the data security standard. Hey, there's a lot of stuff in here that you're supposed to be doing all the time. This isn't a once a year exercise where you go through an audit and have to produce everything all at once a year. There's a lot of requirements to talk about things, activities, processes that you should be doing on a daily basis, maybe a weekly basis, monthly basis, quarterly basis, and so on. So the emphasis in version 3 was really, let's start looking at making this thing an ongoing process. So a lot of emphasis on continuous compliance, continuous security came about in version 3. Version 4 was actually announced right before the pandemic at the PCI community meeting in the fall of 2019. So all that meant was we've had a lot of time to look at version 4. It was available in draft form for comments for the better part of the lockdown 2020 2021. It was finally published, as it says here on this slide, finally getting up to sort of the present in 2022. There's always been tradition that if there was any new requirements, there was a grace period of a year given before entities, which is the generic term for merchants and service providers, the entities get a grace period of a year before having to do any of the thing that's introduced in the new requirements. What's significant, I would say, about version 4 in terms of a theme is that they spent a lot of time, the council and all the people that contributed in terms of feedback, doing an overhaul of the PCI standard, sort of modernizing it and bringing it up to the 21st century. While there's still 6 goals and there's still 12 major requirements, they finally updated a lot of the language to sort of get away from how things were working 20 years ago in terms of network architecture and in terms of even networking technologies. For years, it was references to routers and switches and firewalls. Now, for example, it's generically network security controls, because somewhere in the last 15, 20 years, network appliances came along that did the functionality of a switch and a router and a firewall and a few other things all at once in one device. And even that device these days, more times than not, is a virtual device. So a lot of updating in terms of just bringing things up to modern architecture, modern ways of doing things. And in terms of the evolution of the bad guys, whereas in the early days, the bad guys would break into organizations and steal the data in the repositories, the databases and mainframes where the tens of millions of transaction records were stored with all the credit card information. Sort of twofold. One, that became harder, but two, most retailers especially figured out, oh, we don't need to keep all the credit card information there. So they started eliminating it. So the bad guys started trying to find a new place to steal the data. And that evolved into something that's generically called as skimming. Skimming can be done physically, most commonly done at gas stations at what's called an unattended payment terminal. And it involves also ATMs for that matter, but it involves putting a little extra added devices or using a 3D printer to add a covering on top of a card reader so that as a card's being inserted, the electronic data is being captured before it goes into the actual device. So that was done physically. Now more and more it's being done electronically. So there's for the last 5-6 years there's been electronic skimming attacks that have been out there where due to the creativity, let's say, of the bad guys, they've figured out a way to attack not just the standard classical e-commerce architectures of websites, but also the taking advantage of the way more modern websites and e-commerce sites are architected and attack the things that are usually taken for granted, frankly, and that's things that are on the client side of the browser, of the equation of the site. And so that's where we've come to these two requirements in particular, 643 and 1161.
Yeah, so with all those changes, and that's a wealth of information, and kudos to you to say it so concise and elegantly. A lot of folks are needing a lot more assistance than what they learn and read on their own. So
Mhm.
with that assistance, how does somebody prepare for this assessment and ensure they're compliant? I mean, what does that look like?
Well, for many merchants, the quote unquote larger scale merchants or merchants that have more traditional operations, for the most part, they've been doing PCI for a while now. So the preparation is really uh, in respect to these two requirements in particular, sort of doing an inventory or taking stock of how their e-commerce site is architected. But I would be remiss if I didn't point out what I think is the hugest change here in version 4/4.01 with these two new requirements is for the vast majority of merchants out there that are smaller, that are accustomed to reporting their compliance through what's called a self-assessment questionnaire. And in particular, for those e-commerce merchants, they report using SAQ version A, which is tailored specifically for e-commerce merchants only. And in
Okay.
particular, e-commerce merchants that basically have outsourced the payment function of their website to a PCI compliant third party, and they can demonstrate that. Um, that's pretty much all they've ever had to do.
Okay.
And that's a big change because I was having a conversation with several different groups, including some of my colleagues over the last week, where um, in the past, for this vast number of e-commerce merchants, the exercise has been more or less a paper pushing process. Oh, it's our time to renew, checking in with our third party service provider to make sure that their PCI compliance is up to date and they have what's called the attestation of compliance or AOC. We've got our fresh copy. And this paper exercise is largely done by internal audit or GRC groups, not the technical people. So for these groups in particular, like never before with the advent of SAQA, they need to involve the technical teams, the developers, the IT
Gotcha.
admins that are running the websites, the e-commerce sites, or if they're outsourced to third party, It's the groups within the organization that are maintaining that relationship and keeping track of that. So the business unit, if nothing else. So becoming aware that, oh, there's more involved is the first step. And then, for everybody, in terms of these two requirements, they need to really take a look at how their e-commerce site is architected. How many companies are involved? There's a reference in these requirements to not only third party but fourth party, and I confess I had to look this up. The first party is you that own the e-commerce site. Second party, and I think this is a legal thing more than anything, is the consumer that's on your website that's purchasing something, hopefully. And then third party is anybody else that's involved directly. And a fourth party would be, one level abstraction. Either it's a company that has a relationship with the third party, not you directly. There's a lot of companies apparently involved, entities involved sometimes, depending on the complexity of your e-commerce site, in putting up JavaScripts, which is how very often websites are architected these days. They can be coming from any number of places. So it's important to know who they are, where they are, what they're doing, because that's essentially what requirement 643 is telling you to do ultimately anyway.
Yeah, well, I can tell you it's eye-opening. A lot of folks, to your point, have used and relied on third parties to be compliant. And yeah, I could tell you now, we are out educating, our government partners across the country, folks that are
Mm-hmm.
cities, towns, villages, U.S. Postal Service. Anyone that takes a credit card payment in government is bound to comply by this as well.
Yep.
With that being said, I see three states have actually made legislation. The most strictest is in Washington State, where they regulate and mandate that you follow PCI to the letter for any government infrastructure and or commercial entity. So, with that being said, Jeff, this is a big change to get the word out. This is what we're doing today by getting all the information into this one webinar. Can you kind of
Mm-hmm.
walk us through the two major changes that you've been alluding to, and then kind of dive into the now no longer going to be compliant using a third party entity to do your PCI work?
Well, I will attempt to be succinct. It's funny. I happened to read up. I got the weekly or monthly newsletter from the PCI Council last Friday, and that they mentioned that in terms of these two requirements, there's actually a guide that's coming. They're advertising a guidance document that they're working on, and it just so happens that the somebody from our organization is part of the committee that's reviewing this document, and I happened to get a look at the draft very briefly, and I'm under all sorts of not sworn to secrecy. I'm not even supposed to have seen it yet, so we'll probably get in trouble with the council for me even mentioning it. But what I took notice of that I would share is it's a 70-page document already, and that's just in an early draft form, with a lot of the comments being, hey, we need to expand on this. This needs to move over here. We need to summarize this better. There needs to be more explanation. Two requirements, and there's already a 70-page document. But what it's all about is 643 basically is saying you need to identify all the scripts, which for the most part are JavaScripts. There's the possibility of other scripting languages out there, but you need to identify and inventory every script that's on the part of your e-commerce site where you are launching the payment page, the checkout page. You might call it something different. That's most commonly done these days by using what's called an embedded iframe. In fact, that's one of the qualifications to use SAQA as an e-commerce merchant is you're redirecting by using this iframe to a third-party site or third-party portion of the site, so that all the card data that's being typed in by the consumer is not traversing any of your network, any of your application. It's completely handled by a third party. That's the essence of what qualifies you for SAQA in the first place. But what SAQA is saying in particular is that's not good enough, because the attackers that are doing these electronic skimming type of attacks, they're often targeting the overall e-commerce site, the site that we don't care about because everything's being done over here. The magic happens over here with the third party. So there could be any number of scripts there. That's why I'm saying
Yep.
inventory, figure out what you're doing, because that's the requirement. Inventory, make sure that they're authorized, make sure all the scripts that are running there are ones that you expect and you want them there. And then finally, you need to come up with a way of validating their integrity, assuring that they haven't been tampered with. That's all built into 6.4.3. 11.6.1 related to it focuses more on the headers that get generated very often in modern e-commerce architectures, because you're not really just loading a page anymore that's a complete web application. It's sort of built on the fly very often by some of these scripts. And so there's sort of HTTP headers created that are driving you to different places in theory. And it's all transparent to the consumer, to the second party. It's just the magic that happens. But 11.6.1 says you need to have some sort of automated protection in place to validate that the HTTP headers have not been tampered with or they haven't been altered in some way. You need to have some sort of alerting mechanism in place for that. So that can be a lot of work, and that's where people like me that are a QSA are looking to companies like Human to say, how can you help your clients do this? Because they're not prepared for this. They need help.
Yeah, I could tell you we've definitely seen an uptick, a large uptick of inquiries, for folks actually reaching out for more information and briefings on our PCI solution here at Human. So we're definitely in this with you all, and all of you watching this webinar, and we're here to help, as Jeff has been doing for 2 decades in this space. Human is going to be leading the way and getting you these requirements satisfied. So excellent, Jeff. So Jeff, when it comes down to it, you talked about, a lot of responsibilities, whether it's the financial teams or the cybersecurity teams, policy teams, who's responsible for this? I mean, at one point in time, this was a financial issue. There was a contract through a third party using an iframe, and it was done. But the more and more we hear about these changes, especially you just mentioned in 70 pages, this definitely seems like it's going to be put on many of our cybersecurity professionals and CIOs and chief information security officers to make sure that these are services are deployed. Can you dive into that a little bit for the group?
Yeah, I can try to, and it's a little bit of a multi-pronged answer, because I think one of the biggest shocks that's coming with version 4, as I mentioned already, is the multiple numbers of e-commerce merchants only that have been doing SAQ8 for years. And again, it's just a paper pushing exercise. Are slowly, and in fact, I have a concern about who's actually notifying them. How are they finding out
Yeah.
that there's a whole lot more? If it's not till they sit down in 2025 to do their SAQ and they start reading and say, hey, there's new requirements here. Hopefully they've already had that experience this year and they're working on, hey, there's a lot of new here that we need to address. So at one level, the who me is all the merchants out there that are running e-commerce sites, and they're used to not having to do much because they outsource to a third party. Part of understanding how your e-commerce site is set up is not just functionally, architecturally, but also in terms of who's outsourced everything to what. I mean, I've had clients over the last several years that in terms of their e-commerce site, yeah, they're the merchant, acme.com,
Yep.
that are selling widgets. I go back to Looney Tunes if you're old enough to remember these
Oh yeah, good old
analogies.
widgets.
But acme.com, they don't write their web application. They've outsourced to a third party that has built and maintains their e-commerce application. And oh, by the way, they've got yet another third party that's hosting it. And of course, these days, very often the hosting is done in the cloud by or organizations that advertise themselves as cloud hosting providers, e-commerce providers. The outsourcing, of course, to the payment processing, that's a specific entity, but that's yet another third party. And there could be other third parties involved in terms of, again, these scripts that pop up, like doing inventory, making sure the images of the widgets are kept up to date, and there's a new improved version of the widget. So you got to push the photograph out, and that's all needs to be taken into account. But I think problematically, again, this is still at the high level, is the merchants realizing it's their SAQ. They're the ones that are saying that they are meeting the PCI standards that apply to them, the ones that are found in SAQA. That's what the attestation of compliance is all about. And a lot of them I think, are having this sort of moment of denial, thinking, well,
Right.
wait, now we have to do more. Now there's more work to be done. And then there's a technical aspect to it, because they, at the very least, need to figure out who's responsible for which of these scripts that are running on their website, and
Mhm.
are they theirs? Are they which third party? Who's sort of corralling the third party? Is it the
Mhm.
responsibility of the web developer third party? Have they taken on responsibility for it? Is it the hosting provider? Have they taken on responsibility for it? That all needs to be worked out and sorted out. And at some level, it's a contractual thing. But at the first level, the PCI SAQ attestation of compliance says you, the merchant, are signing off and all these things are in place, whether you're doing it or not, or whether it's outsourced by the third party. That's sort of the macro level exercise. Who, me? And the answer is, until proven differently, it's you, the merchant, that have to do all this.
Yep.
Now, at a more technical level, then, as we were saying, it may not be just the GRC group or the internal audit group or the finance group that's used to just kind of doing the paper exercise. They need to engage the parties within the organization, which traditionally most of these parties, the IT groups and technical groups and security
Mhm.
groups, they don't like to talk to internal audit or finance or GRC, because they're just throwing in more audit work on them and keeping them for their day job. So there's a certain amount of potential for, having to go out and sort of schmooze your own company and trying to, hey, we haven't talked in a while, but guess what? We're about to drop this thing on you because we're now
Yeah.
responsible for it, type of thing.
Yeah, well, that's great because I heard it today on a call with a colleague that there are separate constitutional offices in
Mm-hmm.
our government at the state, local, tribal, territory level,
Mm-hmm.
and even at the federal level, you have separate elected officials and appointed officials. Now that cohesion is going to be more important than ever.
Yep.
Knowing who's got to take care of this, and some of these solutions that are available, to monitor and inventory these scripts, block the bad bots and scripts that don't belong there. Also have integrations into like SIM SOAR environments where
Mm-hmm.
you can ingest them into your Splunk platform. So you'll be looking at your antivirus, you'll be looking at your endpoint security, and now you'll be looking at your bot security and your script security to keep you
Mm-hmm.
compliant. So there's the third party payment systems kind of argument or excuses has been around, since four was out. They just farmed it out and they did it.
Mm-hmm.
Can we get a little more technical? I mean, we're saying, that's no longer going to be the case, but can you let the audience know kind of why is that not the case, and dive into what that why is?
Yeah, I'll certainly make the attempt. In the old days, version 3.2.1 and prior, it was good enough to simply just focus on where the payment card information was. What version 4 now refers to as account data, what we used to call cardholder data. But
Mhm.
the PAN, the credit card number, the expiration date, the security code, that's the stuff that we care about. The initial, and for many years, concern was, or frankly, it was the litmus test of whether things were in scope, systems or applications were in scope, was whether you were transmitting, processing, or storing any of that data, starting with the PAN, primary account number, the credit card number, the
Yep.
16 digits that used to be embossed on your card, and now they're not even barely printed on the card anymore. Just got a new card that's just completely blank. It's weird.
Yeah, I have an
It's
Apple. I have an
flat.
Apple card, the same card.
Um,
Huh.
so traditionally for the most of the 20 years, that's been the rule of thumb is wherever that data is, be either transmitted, processed, or stored, systems are in scope. Because that was being outsourced to a third party service provider so that none of that data that's being typed in by the consumer is going to any of your systems or applications, either the merchant, but to a third party. That's where all the heavy lifting was being moved over to that third party. And they were the ones responsible for the security of that data. But you, the merchant, could just sort of wash your hands and say, we don't see the data, we don't touch the data, so we don't have to follow all these rules, because what do they apply to? There is no data anywhere. In version 4 now, though, while that is still true, that the council has extended the boundary, if you will, the scope, to things other than simply the areas where the transmission, processing, and storing occurs. They're invoking sort of a concept that they introduced, gosh, at least back to version 3, if not older. I think it goes back to version 2, so back to 2010-ish range. The idea of, well, you may not be directly touching the card data, transmitting, processing, storing, but you're sort of in proximity, or you have a related function, or what they very often refer to as a connected system or application, where because of some indirect relationship, there is the possibility that this could, your area could be used as a through point or an attack point for a bad guy to actually ultimately get to the data. So not a direct relationship, but indirect. So
Indirect.
they came up with this phrase, or after transmitting, processing, storing, they say, or could impact the security of account data. And that's kind
Okay.
of where they've dropped that in. That the concept's been around for a while, but they're explicit here in version 4 to saying, we mean the web pages that start with where your embedded iframe or your redirect is coming from. Now, interestingly, in version 4, there was a reference to URL redirect that they sort of cleaned up in version 4.01. In fact, that was one of the reasons for the shift to 4.01, was to clarify what they were talking about in terms of how that third party payment processor, how you get over to there. Traditionally, in the old days, it was simply a URL redirect. So there was a website that was built into the code, and when it came time to check out, the consumer just went to physically another site, and he would even see it in his browser bar. The URL would be, okay, I'm now at checkout.com or whatever, paymentpage.com. So that's one method, but more common, and I haven't seen a URL redirect in years. What we typically see is embedded iframes, so that it's again built into the functionality of creating a web experience. So a consumer is more likely just going to experience a little pop-up window, and that's where they type in their information. That's all happening through this iframe, and the data is not going to the merchant site, so it's meeting that criteria. But the web page where that iframe call is embedded, they're declaring explicitly, no, that web page is what we're talking about. Wherever that is on your website, that's what we're talking about. That's where all these protections come into place. That's where we want the inventory of the JavaScript, and that's where we want the URL headers to be protected with some sort of detection and alerting mechanism.
Excellent. Well, it only makes sense. I mean, you look at how these revisions come out, over the years. And every day, Jeff, you read and see new sophisticated threats. The threats are ever changing. So being able to, go pay your parking ticket, on your city's website, or to pay your taxes or whatever not, that originating page is where that hijack or that vulnerability could occur. And that's an attack vector. So, kudos
Yep.
to them for taking this holistic approach. So excellent. From a selection of tools and what they're going to need to be compliant, do you want to kind of just give a brief overview of what that looks like, for an average city or average company that needs to take this on?
Well, the holy grail is to be able to find tools that can do more than one thing.
Good
A
point.
lot of the technical requirements in the PCI standard are traditionally met with a point solution. And so for however many technical requirements there are, you've got that many technical solutions out there. So ideally, if you've already got tools in place that are doing other things for you in terms of monitoring and detection and things like that, so the security protections of your website, if you can find out that they have features that can be tweaked or turned on or added, or services can be extended that cover these new requirements, that's the ideal. I mean,
Nice.
that's the win
Yeah,
for most
no,
consumers of your
definitely.
products.
Yeah, that's good. That's good feedback. Just a insight to humans platform. Our PCI compliance module is just one of several modules. So
Right.
you can adopt other modules to do other things, protect your infrastructure of your website and your web journey. So
Well,
with that being,
conversely, if you've got clients that are looking just to meet these two requirements, if you can tell them, oh, but you can also do this much more and meet
yeah.
or satisfy this much more in the PCI, that's the best buy for
Yeah,
most
now you've probably
organizations.
seen over the years in your military, your government experience that, back from '94 when, Symantec had the antivirus market and then people were just Frankensteining,
Mhm.
security infrastructure. Having a holistic, platform definitely makes your life easier and it's a lot more fluid experience.
Well,
So,
it's certainly a goal. I don't know if I've ever
yeah.
seen it play out, but there's still a
I
lot of
agree.
point solutions out there.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. So listen, that it brings us to our questions, Q&A portion of today's webinar. So with that, Robert, you want to queue up some of those questions that we had to come in?
Absolutely, Jamie. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. As a
Yep.
reminder to everyone in the audience, just click on the Q&A tab and ask your questions. We have a few questions that have queued up. So, Jeff and Jamie, why does this matter? What happens if I'm not current? You've got into a lot of detail on how to be current, how to be compliant. But if I'm not compliant, what happens to me?
Take it away, Jeff.
Well, traditionally, the first thing that happens is somebody finds out about it, and merchants technically report their compliance to their acquiring bank. The card brands have said all merchants, all we care about is the acquiring banks, and if one of our acquiring banks has a merchant that is compromised, we will fine you and we will find the acquiring bank. And of course, the acquiring banks are allowed to flip that over to their merchants. So um, sort of the worst case scenario is you have an incident, you have a breach, and you're found out to be non-compliant. Uh, Lots of costly things happen, despite having to pay for what you need to do to become compliant. Ahead of that, what happens is you get fined. If the card brands are aware that you're not compliant, and technically that means your acquiring bank isn't doing its job, they can levy fines. I just noticed recently that Visa, in fact, last April, updated their T's and C's for any of their merchants. We just happened to stumble upon it this past week. My team that I work with, and there was actually fines listed in dollar amounts. And I'm not going to give Visa more or less credit, but the fines are real. So fining is the first thing could happen, and there's other penalties if you suffer a breach and you're found to be non-compliant at the time of the breach. So it's all all comes down to
Money.
the money.
Yeah, it makes the world go round. On top of that, I'll just add, Robert, especially in the public sector, well, public sector and private sector both, yeah, the credibility of the organization. You're blasted on the New York Times, blasted on, across the newspapers for
Mhm.
this incident that could have been prevented, and especially in government. The taxpayers expect, that they're going to log into a safe environment to be able to do their daily citizen duties. So, very good question, though. What else you got?
So Jamie did mention it. Public sector, what's different for the public sector when dealing with PCI DSS 4?
Well, in public sector, they've been dependent and relying on typically the financial wings of government to kind of enroll in third-party contracts with payment processors. So, as Jeff had so elegantly explained earlier, that was fine, and you were within scope, and everything was fine. Maybe easy day. Now, with these new changes, that's not going to fly anymore. And the finance wing, the auditing wing, the controllers, the state comptrollers, the county clerks, every different level of government, they don't have the ability to deploy a server or deploy a cloud solution and have an analyst monitor those bad bots or scripts, allow you to stop those scripts and look at the false positives. That's going to be brought into the wheelhouse of our security teams across the nation, our IT staff. Those folks will add this as yet another tool into their toolkit. So there will be changes, to the responsibilities. I remember this, quite vividly from 2017 on. Elections really never had a role in security across the county governments until there was a breach, and then every county in the country literally went out and got platforms that the IT teams took on. Then IT and elections began working, or security teams and elections became working hand in hand together to keep that safe as well. So I compare it to that, Robert.
Well, Jamie, it's amazing how your responses lead into the next question. Because the next question is, my roles in cybersecurity. PCI compliance has always been finance. Why should this be a concern for me?
Well, we alluded to it beforehand. It's a big question, and just being a question here today. Every time we meet with somebody, whether it's out in the field or on our own briefings that we're doing, they're like, "I don't deal with that. That is the comptroller's job. I don't deal with that. That is the finance person's role." Now, ultimately, that might be the person that was responsible for certifying and saying we're compliant. But in the end, it's going to take a team effort, because the expertise that goes into now needing monitoring of malicious bots and scripts will fall into the wheelhouse of those security teams.
Great. I got
Yeah,
one.
well,
Oh,
if
go
I
Go
could
ahead.
ahead,
add real
Jeff.
quickly, Robert. Um, one of the problems that has been ongoing with the sort of the PCI compliance program, as it were, has always been, um, and you just alluded to it, Jamie. When you're doing a self-assessment questionnaire, you're saying that you're doing the things. I, as a QSA, a qualified security assessor, who's charged with going into organizations, the larger organizations that have to do the full report on compliance assessment, um, that's always been kind of fun and easy, because I can go in and read all the policy documents and procedure documents that you have, and you can tell me you're doing all the things. But at the end of the day, you've got to show me. So I always thought,
Yes.
that's kind of, it's kind of hard to hide, because I got to see the evidence that you're really doing the things that you're doing, that you claim to be doing. And therefore it should be pretty easy to follow and make sure you're doing all the things, and it leads to making sure you have good written policies and procedures, because you actually have to do all the things. But that doesn't always happen for organizations that are quote unquote smaller, that don't have a third party coming in, and sort of, okay, show me what you got. And it's not to say that people are being that are doing the self-assessing are deliberately being deceptive. For years, it's had to have been an officer of the company or the organization that signs off on the attestation with. There was a period, I don't know if it still stands or not, but there was a period where they were floating the idea of personal liability. If you, an officer of the company, signed off on attestation and then were later breached, there is a potential for personal liability, not just as an officer of the company. And these are all efforts over the years to try to get enforcement, try to get people to actually do the right thing and follow it. In the public sector, this is problematic, as we've alluded to, because there's so much distribution of responsibility. And I mean, I have a municipality as a client right now, and I work for people in the finance group, and they're going around, and we've been working with them for years. They have a hard time going around to all the IT groups and the developers and the website maintainers and trying to get them to do anything because, well, it's just finance telling us to do this stuff. Who are they? So I mean, there's a certain aspect of winning the hearts and minds of the IT staff that is daunting in my experience.
I got one final great question. I think that'll help,
Okay.
maybe. With AI being in the news and AI is supposed to make our jobs much easier, is there any way you can use AI in your compliance for PCI?
I'll let you take that, Jeff.
Well, I'll caveat this by, assuming we're talking about the AI promise of the future that actually hasn't been seen yet, or not to the degree that it's been hyped, but there is something to improved, highly automated, especially taking advantage of LLMs, learned language models. I think there's opportunity for AI to certainly help in the search and the hunt. Because to me, security really begins after you've done all the things to secure all your stuff. Um, there is no guarantee when you do all that stuff that bad things don't happen, and that's one of the 800-pound gorillas that our whole industry doesn't like to talk about. But that's really where security begins, where you have to have things to detect and automate and find the bad behaviors, the anomalous, malicious activities. And AI really has the potential for helping out that process, so that you're detecting things earlier and minimizing the damage, because that's the essence of what security is pragmatically. It's not this idea of secure everything and we're impenetrable and nothing bad can happen because we're just solid as a rock. Doesn't really work that way.
Good questions. All right. With that being said, thank you, Robert, for the Q&A narration. I want to give you a few moments here, Jeff, to kind of discuss online business systems. So what do you do, and what are you about?
Yeah, I appreciate it. I work for what's called the risk security and privacy practice, which is one half of online business systems. The other half, the much older part of the company, going back to the mid 80s, IT, software development, IT services company. We are at the macro level, a services company. My boss came to work for the company some 12 or 13 years ago, and stood up the risk security and privacy practice. One of our bread and butter services is doing this PCI assessment work. So we have a bunch of QSAs. A lot of us have been together for years and years, but collectively, we as a company are a professional services company that can help you in all aspects of IT and doing business on the web and figuring out how to navigate the future with things like digital transformation. And we have, I even read an email today about what we're doing with AI. So, we're the people who like to talk to you and experts and help you figure out how to do things better and right and efficiently and not cost a whole lot of money.
All right, excellent. Sounds great. So with that being said, I first off want to thank you, Jeff, for your time today, all of your teachings, your wisdom. As Robert said, this will be recorded so we can distribute this out for those that couldn't make it today with us. And on behalf of everyone at Human, we appreciate the partnership and looking forward to working with you on projects in the future. And those of you that are watching today, reach out to us. We're able to respond with briefings, get you a good understanding of what you're up against, and people like Jeff can guide you through the long processes as he's described today. So with that, I thank you very much, and I wish you farewell.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks.